Hello and welcome. You're watching Faultlines on NDTV. I'm Gaurie Dwivedi. This is a show where we decode the truth beneath the headlines and beyond the divide. Today, we are going to talk about Nepal, which has been rocked by protests as a former king returns to claim his throne. Pro-monarchy protests have taken over Nepal as a frustrated proletariat demands the former king, Gyanendra Shah, lead Nepal towards change and, more importantly, stability. Restore the country as a Hindu state. The government is not taking this lying down. So what are the issues? What is the real crux of the matter here? Well, it's a battle for identity. It's a battle for Nepal's identity. That is the biggest fault line that's running across Nepal for 60 years, ever since it first signed the treaty with India. One that has religious tones as well and has deeper strategic impact. Viewers, now Nepal is on the edge as people are frustrated by the government's lack of a cohesive roadmap. There's corruption, there's failure in terms of governance, economic challenges that continue to rise, and they're becoming increasingly disillusioned. People need answers. They are demanding a return to what they claim was a better time, when their king ensured that there was stability and there was a road to economic prosperity. Thousands and thousands of people, all royal supporters, have flocked to the streets in Nepal, waving flags, chanting slogans, demanding that their king come back and restore Hinduism as a state religion. And this, of course, happened just 100 meters away from, well, pro-government protesters. And this is the battle of identity that is playing out in Nepal. What is exactly the real issue here? I want to first play out this report that tells you why this runs at the very heart of not just Nepali politics, Nepali society, culture, ethos, and of course, religion. Listen in.
A former king back to claim his throne, reigniting a country's decades-old battle for identity. Nearly 17 years after Nepal abolished the 239-year-old Hindu monarchy, ousting King Gyanendra Shah, he returned to Kathmandu in March this year, vowing to unite a Nepal divided by ideology. Thousands filled the streets, echoes ringing, "Come King, save the nation." Not everyone welcomed the king with open arms. Nepal's major political parties, the Nepal Congress, CPN-UML, CPN, strongly opposed the monarchy's revival. Protests quickly turned violent across Kathmandu, buildings set ablaze, pitting frustrated citizens against leaders at the helm of Nepal's government. In counter-rallies, two former prime ministers, Pushp Kamal Dahal Prachanda and Madhav Kumar Nepal, warned him not to dream of reclaiming the throne. Trying to snip the movement in the bud, the police cracked down on the protests, arresting 110 protesters, including key pro-monarchy leaders. Anarchist Durga Prasai, a Maoist leader turned pro-monarchy voice, was also later arrested for provoking protesters. Since Shah's return, Nepal has seen waves of pro-monarchy protests over the past few months, fueled by public dissatisfaction over political instability, a stagnating economy, and a demand for change. Led by the Rashtriya Prajatantra Party, pro-monarchist groups demand establishing Nepal as a Hindu state and reinstate the over 200-year-old monarchy.
हामी सशक्त रूपमा आन्दोलन गर्दैछौं कि नेपालको हितको निमित्त जबसम्म संवैधानिक राष्ट्र स्तर हिन्दू राष्ट्र स्थापित हुँदैन तबसम्म हाम्रो आन्दोलन जारी रहन्छ.
After months of simmering tension, the pro-monarchy movement began renewed protests this week to mark the 24th Memorial Day of the Nepal Royal Palace massacre, when King Birendra Shah, King Gyanendra Shah's elder brother, and several members of the royal family were brutally killed by Crown Prince Dipendra in 2001. While these renewed protests were relatively peaceful, the fervour among the thousands of protesters was evident, chanting slogans against the republic system and Prime Minister KP Sharma Oli. Fearing the movement will grow stronger, Nepal's former Home Minister Kamal Thapa and about half a dozen others were arrested during the protests. The government also banned protests and public gatherings in several parts of Kathmandu. While similar protests have occurred in 2021 and 2023, the air around this wave of protests is different, triggered by widespread public dissatisfaction and disillusionment. It remains to be seen where Nepal's age-old battle for identity is headed. Bureau Report, NDTV World.
All right, viewers, to understand what really is happening on ground, before we go back in time to understand why this is not a new issue, I want to first get in Bhusan Dahal, who's a journalist joining me live from Nepal, to understand the issues that are playing out and, more importantly, how the situation is unfolding. Mr. Dahal, thanks so much for speaking to NDTV. Let me start by asking you, at this stage, explain to us the situation on ground, how grim it is, given the fact that these protests are unlike what the country has seen in the past.
Thank you very much for having me. Primarily, the situation on the ground is not as grim as reports portray. There is dismay. And as your report rightly said, it's primarily for or against the delivery aspect of the government of the day and the politics and the polity we've adhered to govern Nepal for the past 18 years. And the pro-monarchy aspect to the entire protests in Kathmandu was a very small residual reality that Nepal lived with and which will live for much longer than people want this to remain. But at this moment of time, the geometrical growth in the dismay of a common man is purely governance aspect of the government of the day.
Okay.
And that is sugar-coated by the mesmerizing memories that people had about monarchy when we actually were a monarchical state. People expect tangible diplomatic feats around the region, in the neighborhood, and the globe itself. We are represented lesser and more inefficiently these days in the global forums. Nepal's name as a South Asian entity has fizzled out over the years. That has not been worked upon. And these are the real political factors that the unrest in Nepal at the moment is contributed for.
Very quickly, Mr. Bhushan, I want to ask you this, that while, of course, the disenchantment that people have with governments is a very major factor, I want to understand from you the desire, as far as the pro-monarchy protests are concerned, to go back in time. What is the cause of it? I mean, you are saying, of course, public disenchantment is one, but what else?
I think people have started flipping over the history books. And when we adhered to monarchy, monarchy had a very well-deserved representation of the country the world over and in global forums. And there were issues that need immediate attention. It was just a one-door policy. These days, I told you earlier that delivery is the biggest issue. Okay. If you go to a government office, if people want things done, yes. If you're not known to the office, if you're not known to the personnel,
so what you're saying is corruption. Corruption is a major factor as far as why there is growing disenchantment that people have. I'm going to leave it there. Bhusan, thank you so much for joining me from Kathmandu to really decode what is turning out to be a very major issue that India is keeping an eye on. But viewers, as we now decode as far as the fault lines that we have been mentioning in Nepal, I'm going to point out why is it so important to go back in time to understand the issue related to Nepal. And I'm going back in time all the way to 1950, because unless you do, you cannot understand this fault line that exists and is so important for India from a social, political, economic, strategic point of view. Okay, now I'm taking a case of two they were provinces earlier and countries earlier, which is Sikkim and Nepal. Now, as far as Nepal is concerned, India signed and inked a treaty of peace and friendship way back in 1950. This was under Pandit Nehru, and this was a time when the Ranas were there, and the king had been deposed, and he was in fact living in exile in India at that time. This is the time 1950 when that deal was signed. Now, in contrast, there was also a deal with that Sikkim signed, where it became a protectorate of India. So you can see what worked for Sikkim that didn't work for Nepal. As I said, unless you draw comparisons and go back in time in history, you cannot really understand the present. The other fact is, let's go back to that. In Sikkim, in 1975 is when the referendum was signed, came into play, and that is when the monarchy was abolished, and Sikkim became a part of India. That's the one. Let's take that Sikkim part of it to understand how it unfolded. As far as Nepal is concerned, in 1975, again the same year, it pushed for a zone of peace that India refused. So there are several layers of what really happened and transpired between India and Nepal. So there was a time, as I said, when the treaty was signed in 1950 between Pandit Nehru and Ranas, when the king was in exile. Now, when the king came back to power, there's historical literature that supports this claim that the king offered to unite and be a part of India as one of the provinces, like Sikkim. Something that, as I said, historical literature supports is an offer that the government of the day, that time, Pandit Nehru, was not in favor of. One can surmise it could also be because of the fact that India under Pandit Nehru projected a secular image, there were secular credentials, and Nepal was a Hindu kingdom, Nepal was a Hindu country. That played on whether or not to merge India and Nepal during the time of the exiled king. So which is why that deep fault line continues to remain. In Nepal is important, but given the fact that there is this historical undertone, it impacts how India and Nepal's relations have progressed. I'm going to slip into a very short break, come back on the other side, talk more about what this means for India and Nepal future going forward. As I said, we've gone back in time to understand the fault line. We're going to come back and decode that in greater detail to set the roadmap to understand the future.